Welcome to the C Word, the Conservators podcast. Today we're talking about getting your foot in the door.
I'm Liz Bert, a private paintings conservator located in Amsterdam in the Netherlands.
I'm Phedra Komodromou. I am a conservator of antiquities based in Nicosia, Cyprus. Hey, everyone. This is a first for the C Word podcast. Jenny and Chloe will not be with us. Why is that, Liz?
Because it's the ECP episode.
Emerging Conservation Professionals.
But it's not just the two of us today. We also have a special guest host.
Hi, I'm Alexis. I am also an emerging professional.
Shall we actually do some introductions?
Well, where should I start? My name is Phedra. Phedra is an ancient Greek tragedy. So I was predestined to study classical archaeology and to continue my path into archaeological conservation. And so I studied classical archaeology as my undergraduate, and I went on multiple digs. And during my digs, I actually developed a love for post-excavation work. So that would be cleaning the artifacts, sorting them, and cataloging them. And I got really interested in how the artifacts would react to being exposed to the open air and sun and human touch. And so that's what got me into conservation. So I then decided to go to Cardiff University to study objects conservation. I wanted to concentrate on archaeological objects, and Cardiff Uni gave me the opportunity to do that. I did settle on a 16th century tankard for a while, but that's as modern as it got for me. And then ever since I graduated in 2022, I've been basically working in different archaeological sites. And now I am in Cyprus. So I moved to a different country, and I'm working for the Department of Antiquities in Cyprus, conserving antiquities. So this is me.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
Alexis?
I have a somewhat atypical, I guess, introduction into conservation. And it's funny because so many of the people that I'm close to now remember me saying this years ago, like decades ago, that my dream job would be conserving art. And when I was in university in the US, it just didn't feel like one of those professions that was available to me. It wasn't something that you could study in your bachelor's. And yeah, for some reason, it just in my mind seemed like one of those like fairy tale dream jobs that like didn't really exist unless you lived in like Greece or Italy or some romantic place, you know?
I mean, to be fair, that's exactly how it feels when you're in the US.
100%. Yeah. And so I actually got my bachelor's in art history. And then for about 4.5 years after graduating university, I actually had a completely different career as an event planner in Washington, D.C. So I did weddings and galas and fundraising events. And there was a little bit of that creativity in designing, but it was a complete removal really from art and antiquities. And then about 4 years ago, I luckily found my way back into the art world. I left Washington, D.C., I moved to Germany, and I got my master's in Germany. And then I went to Italy for a year to study in Florence for an additional professional certificate in conservation and restoration. And for the past almost a year now, which is crazy, I've been back in Berlin freelancing on my own. So for about 3.5 years, I've been in and out of studios, working while I study, and I have had the opportunity, which is so wonderful and so fortunate, to work in studios all around Europe and the UK. So it's been a really amazing experience, but definitely feeling newly emerged.
Well, conservation is a very small field, but I feel like the group of people that start in America and come to Europe, it's even smaller.
Mm-hmm.
Between Alexis and I, there are quite a lot of commonalities. So I also went to a program in Florence, and it is the same program that Alexis went to. We both went to Lorenzo de Medici. There are some professors there that we both had in common, which is really cool. I enjoyed that experience, especially since, despite the fact that it was only a bachelor's program, it was a bachelor's program focused on conservation. So we were doing hands-on work within the first year of study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing crazy that you found that so early.
Yeah, well, I found conservation because I was actually interested in forensic science. Anyone who knows American television knows we've got a lot.
Oh my gosh, 100%.
I loved forensic files. Love.
For me, it was NCIS. I loved Abby with her little pigtails.
Oh my gosh. A woman after my own heart. We had the same upbringing, clearly.
Oh, perfect.
Oh yeah. CSI. Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So I really had my heart set on forensic science. And then I was in Boston with my uncles, and they are both very much museum goers. So they took me to the MFA, and around the corner in just some tiny little gallery space, there was a small exhibition about art conservation at the MFA. And upon finding out that I could have the best of both worlds, the science and the art, I was just completely sold. And that's what I looked for when I was going to get my bachelor's. So that led me to finding the program in Italy, especially since I did my research at the time and found out that there were only 3 master's programs in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very hard to get into. Really, props to anybody listening who's trying to get into those programs, or you already got in. Congratulations and good luck. You can do it. So after my bachelor's degree in Florence, I did my master's in Amsterdam, which I think I touched on a little bit in the last episode. So I won't really go into that whole thing again. But currently, I'm emerging from my studies. I've finished my master's program, and now I've started my own business as a paintings conservator here in Amsterdam.
I'm actually impressed by both of you. I really admire emerging conservation professionals that go straight into freelancing and private practice. I find that's amazing. It takes a lot of guts to do that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think something that's not touched upon quite as much in university is how many of us don't go on to get a museum job. Like, there are so many of us who have to work in the private sphere or work for ourselves because there aren't that many museum jobs that are available. And depending on, where you're located, who knows if there are any. So
that is true.
Yeah, it's we're out here.
You really got to make your own opportunities when you're a freelance conservator, especially when you're emerging.
Yeah. What do you guys feel? I mean, I know that we talked about what does ECP stand for, but what do you think emerging means? What does that mean to you?
So I actually went online and Googled what does emerging professional, what does it mean? And, they're extremely vague. Some say, it's a student or some and has less than 10 years experience or 5 years experience or less than 3 projects that they've worked on. So it's very vague. And I think it's something that is internal. So it's however a specific person feels. somebody might have 3 years experience and feel very confident in their work. Somebody may have 8 years experience and still feel like they have much to learn.
And that can also depend on the type of training and education that you have. If it's something that you have to spread out over multiple years, I'm sure that would play a role in feeling like you're emerging once you're done with it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's something that's impossible to define at the end of the day. And Phedra, you mentioned confidence in your work, but that is also something, especially in our field, that is a bit of a tricky topic, because certainly in terms of client-facing relations or confidence in promoting yourself, that's incredibly important, and you should feel secure in the treatments that you're doing. But overconfidence in conservation can be very dangerous. So, patience and care and a little bit of, I don't want to say hesitancy, but, caution is important.
Absolutely. Yeah, I actually had a conversation with a conservator who came to Cyprus last week. She was telling me, "Oh, I saw your LinkedIn. You have so much experience." Because to be fair, I've been volunteering and interning in museums since I was 16, constantly, because I was told gain as much experience as you can. But really, I only have about a year and a half of professional experience. And so in the UK, where I studied, the experience you gain from volunteer work and all of that before you even graduate is very important, and it counts. When you're interviewed, they ask you all kinds of questions about your previous experience. But where I am currently, only the experience after you've received your diploma is counted as professional experience. And also, you've had to complete at least 6 months.
Yeah, I think that ECPs now are just in general a lot more international. And so when you have different regulations for different countries and you have ECPs traveling between them and trying to get internships, fellowships, jobs, there's a lot to juggle in terms of requirements. And unfortunately, that's just something that you kind of have to be on your game with. A student that I studied with, Nikita Shah, she was from India and she was studying in the Netherlands, and that visa was a nightmare and a half. And she just always was on her game with every single documentation, file, everything. Now she's working in the United States. And so there's just no escaping the bureaucracy, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And there's no cut and dry scenario for here are the credentials that you need and here are the ones that are required by everyone. It's every country's got a different game. I would say as much experience as you can possibly get it. And even if it's not, like Phedra said, if it's not counted because it was before it doesn't matter. Like, that will pay off for you regardless. I think that's incredibly important and invaluable.
Yes, absolutely. You are building your skills. So the skills that you gain through those experiences are very much there. It's just a matter of whether it counts during the application process.
Yeah. And unfortunately, for a lot of those processes, you really just have to check the right boxes. And, for me, that's been something that I've been struggling a little bit with because my credentials are irregular for Germany. A lot of people here have the 5-year diploma, and a lot of museums require you to just check that box, or you have to have a bachelor's and a master's specifically in conservation restoration. So, in Germany, I can work for organizations that work with museums, but I probably will not be directly hired by a museum. So it's interesting that there are just different hoops that you have to jump through depending on where you are.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, that's so interesting.
I largely got my master's degree because I understood that it was important to have one in order to get a job, not necessarily because I was so motivated academically to do so.
It is interesting that conservation is one of the only professions, of course, other than like the medical field, where
Right?
unless you have a master's, it's really tough to be competitive.
Like you really can't do anything unless you have it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you would think that considering all of the hoops and all of the requirements and the pre-internships and the fellowships and whatever is required, that the starting salaries would be significant.
A little higher, a little bit.
Yeah, that's another story, I guess.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that's an issue that we really can't solve. I mean, we're just entering the field, so we don't have enough power to be forcing those conversations to happen.
Yeah, what do you think about that? How do we fix this?
Well, for those of us who work in institutions, I think just the basic advice of talking to your coworkers about how much money they make, that doesn't even need to be institutions, just talking amongst private conservators, how much do you charge by the hour, talking about practical things in terms of running a business, not just conservation treatments.
Mm-hmm.
I think that a lot of different professions in the museum field are going through this exact same issue right now. Yeah. It's certainly not limited to conservators.
That's true. I was wondering, when you were completing your studies and training, did you have any courses about how to become a freelancer or what to charge clients?
Absolutely not. That would have been incredible, honestly. And I think it's so important, but no, unfortunately, I did have a class about budgeting for fundraising, but that was more geared toward, I know, it's hilarious. Yeah, that was more geared toward if you're working for like a cultural heritage site and how to like bring in tourism and get fundraising for that, not necessarily like
how to make your own coin.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
I had actually a 2-hour class. It was the last class of my master's degree, and it was all about what you should charge clients as a conservator, as a starting conservator. And our professor basically listed all the costs between materials, just taxes, cutting all the costs one by one. In the UK, it was in the context of the UK, of course. And at the end of all of the calculations, as emerging professionals, he was advising to charge at least 35 to 40 pounds per hour, which is so much higher than what institutions.
Oh, I was going to say that's low.
No, actually, if you look at what UK institutions pay currently, their junior conservators or their intern, postgraduate interns, it is much higher, I'd say.
Yeah, I think it also depends. Like if you're working for a museum or an institution as an employee, then you are not paying your own studio rent. They're assisting with insurance and taxes. So I think that's why maybe that number is a little bit low, because at least in Germany, 36 is minimum wage as a freelancer.
Wow.
And that's if you don't have to pay additionally for travel and accommodation. I mean, that's really like taxes, insurance, general expenses to live.
I recently started charging my clients and having to decide how much I was going to make per hour. And pretty much every time that I talked to a conservator, I raised it by about €5 because I'd say,
Absolutely.
Oh, I was thinking it should be like 30. No, 30. Okay, I guess I'll do 35. No, you're worth more than that.
Yep.
I was really happy to have a lot of people in my life that were encouraging me to go for more, because if it had been left up to me, I probably would have undersold myself. And that those people don't necessarily need to be conservators, but it's really important to have people in your corner, especially if you're going out for private conservation and starting your own business.
Absolutely.
But it's such a tricky line to walk for emerging professionals, because I absolutely agree. I mean, do not undersell yourself. One of the first pieces of advice I got actually from a UK conservator said one thing that he wishes he knew when he first started his business was to charge appropriately. He said 1/3 of your prospective business, they should walk out the door based on price alone. Like, you should not be serving everyone.
That's good.
But that's such a hard thing as an emerging professional. You want that business, you need that business. And it's so tempting to be flexible or be competitive with price. But I think that really one of the only ways that we are going to, as a community, either raise the bar or make a change so that we are not underpaid as a whole, as a profession, we need to stick to our guns. I mean, there's so much required to becoming a professional in conservation. Regardless of just our time and our expertise, there are also a lot of additional costs that need to be considered. And I think a lot of people are seeing now these like what seem to be quick and easy treatments, and are thinking, oh, this is a very small painting. Oh, this is a tiny vase or whatever. And they think that it will just be quick, easy. It's not worth a whole lot. The restoration shouldn't cost that much. But sometimes that really doesn't matter. It just takes time.
That's a big part of being a private conservator, though. When you're a conservator in an institution, you don't really have to justify your work to anyone in the same way that you have to when you're working privately. You need to be able to explain in layman's terms why the work that you're doing is necessary and why it's worth the amount that it is.
Absolutely. It's tricky.
I get that. I mean, we do have time constraints ourselves. We sometimes, if we're working on projects within a museum, are given quite unrealistic timeframes as well, because they have a specific budget for us. So they tell us you have, 2 years to complete all of these artifacts. And you're thinking to yourself, that doesn't make sense. That would require me to conserve 2 artifacts per day,
Because they're your full-time employer, you have to work to whatever their schedule is. Whereas for Alexis and me, when we're working privately, we can in some ways set our schedules a lot easier in the way that it's us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, in my case right now, we're 7 conservators. We have 3 years to conserve 6,500 artifacts. I counted today how many artifacts I've done in 10 months. The result is 54. I mean, I'm not working super fast, nor am I working super slow, I'd say. I'm taking the time on certain artifacts that need more time, and I'm working faster on artifacts that need minimal intervention. So it's very difficult, even within an institution, to figure out your time management.
But I think that's the reality after you finish your training for everybody, because when you're training, you're just working at a different speed, not only because you're learning, but you haven't developed an eye or the muscle skills yet. And so you're being very cautious, which is good, but you can't continue that practically, no matter what you're doing as a conservator, private or in an institution. There are just larger demands that go beyond yourself and the artwork.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of also all of the paperwork that you have to do.
Oh, sure.
At least for from my experience at university, I had to look at the history of the object and find its historical significance, its values, whether aesthetic or historical or blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, when you're conserving 6,000 objects in 2 years, you don't have time for any of that.
No, and also they hired archaeologists to do that exact thing. So I very rarely look at the historical context. Have you had any clients, both of you actually, who have asked you to do more documentation research?
Yes, I have actually. My most recent client, so it's a historical castle out in the east of the Netherlands, and there is a portrait there that they know is identified as one of the sons of, a previous owner of the castle. It's a 17th century portrait. And this owner had two sons. One was a cook and one was a priest. And the guy in the painting has a little bit of like a neck collar going on. So he looks a bit priestly. But written on the back of the painting, it says, "This is the son who is a cook, signed 17, whatever."
Interesting.
And so there's been a lot of contention about, well, what son is this? Turns out it's a lining, so it's not the original back of the canvas.
Interesting.
So the writing on it doesn't matter. While I was doing the cleaning, I didn't uncover anything, but I did get the chance to look a little bit closer and kind of think about it while I worked. The figure has a little medallion that's hanging around his neck on a medal. And nestled in there is a little saintly figure.
Mm-hmm.
The man that I'm working for, he knows the history of this family quite well. And turns out this is the iconography that matches the patron saint of the son who was a priest.
That's fun.
So that was pretty exciting.
Beautiful.
To be able to help them identify that.
Yeah, that's always really fun. I mean,
Yeah.
You'll always get the client that says, well, if you are able to uncover a signature, that would be great. And it's like, you and me both. Like, I would love that, like whatever happens. But when the opportunity, and if it's a piece that has that kind of iconography that is researchable, of course, that's always fun because you can, when you can figure something out about a piece that's, I don't know, there's something that's like weirdly magical about it. Yeah, I wouldn't say that you always get the opportunity, or at least not always the opportunity to charge for it and have it be like a paid part of your job. Unfortunately, one of those things about being a freelancer is time is actually money.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. I think that, I've met a lot of conservators, ECPs, as well as professionals. And I think as a generalization, it's a field of people that are very much analytical and enjoy a good history, a good puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that serves you really, really well when you are in your studies, especially like in a master's program or something. But it can be a really difficult adjustment to go from that kind of in-depth, like really heavy brain work and move more into the practical, everyday, either running a business or working with a group of people in a studio. Like, it's a lot more complex.
Yeah, it's true. And even to take that further, when you're at university and you're doing a lot of research on top of developing your manual skills, you might spend a couple of hours in the lab, but you don't necessarily do a whole 8-hour workday, or you don't do 5 8-hour work days in a row, So
yeah,
it is a completely different work in that sense as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Phedra, since you are the only one who is, or the one of us who is employed by an actual institution, how do you feel about that transition? And also, like, in terms of searching for jobs, how did you find it?
Okay, so I had a very difficult time when I was searching for a job. It didn't last very long, I admit, but I was miserable for about for 4 months because I was searching for employment while also writing my dissertation. So there's that stress. Then the other question was, where on earth was I going to live? That kind of struggle. So we ended up in Athens. And I thought to myself, okay, let's try this out. I've never lived in Greece, even though I am half Greek. So I had no clue what the Greek system was. I also had learned all of the conservation vocabulary in English and didn't know how to speak conservation in Greek at the time either. So I emailed every single museum in Athens and got 0 responses. That was quite frustrating because, again, at the same time, I was trying to find an apartment to live in, and I was moving every 3 or 4 days from Airbnb to Airbnb. In the meantime, I was spending my evenings writing my dissertation, mornings trying to find a job. So that was really stressful for me. And so in Greece, because I don't have an undergraduate degree in conservation, I am actually not allowed to work in government as a conservator. I am considered an archaeologist there. But I can work as a conservator for other private institutions, usually foreign archaeology schools. So at some point, I emailed the French School of Archaeology, l'École Française d'Athènes, the French School of Athens. And I said, I exist.
Here I am.
Yeah, here I am. I'm in Delphi on a 2-week holiday. Can I come in and meet you? And we see where that goes. But the process of applying for jobs was so daunting. And then I saw that the Cypriot government was hiring conservators to build a completely new national museum. And as soon as I saw that, I said, I need that job.
Wow.
And I saw an email address. I sent my CV, a portfolio, all that stuff to that email address. And then I got a phone call the next day saying, hey, the hiring process is actually completely different. You need to go on this website and send us all these documents, So really, because I'm so international and I had no idea where I was going to end up in the world, I had no idea what the systems were in different countries. Mm-hmm. So I went into Greece and then to Cyprus, just completely clueless, but somehow I managed.
Wow.
Well, I think that, you telling that story, it actually seems like you did a lot of the things that I tell ECPs to do when they ask, how do you find a job after you do your studies? You cold emailed people. You went to people's studios. Not all networking has to happen at a conference. A lot of it can just be interpersonal one-on-one, which I think is actually a great transition into talking about some of the work that Alexis does.
Yes.
Because Alexis, not only are you a private conservator, you're also the brains behind Conservation Conversation on Instagram. Did I get the order of that right?
Honestly, it doesn't matter. You can say whatever you want. When I was first looking, Conservation Conversations sounds like that makes more sense. But because conservation is also a term that is used for nature conservation, there are 700 accounts. And so just out of default, Conversation Conservation came to be, which, it is what it is. It has been, I get 3 years now, I guess, since I started that.
Did you start it in the pandemic?
Yes. I guess, do we need a backstory? I guess
we'd love a backstory.
Yes.
Okay, I'll give a quick backstory. I had moved the previous year to Germany. And very quickly, we went on like an 8-month lockdown for COVID. And so I am in the midst of completing my master's and trying to assess the conservation world around me in Europe. and meet everybody I can meet and see everything that I can see. And I'm not allowed to leave my house. So I actually started the Instagram for myself originally, just to collect as much as I could in one place. Because if you're not a member to an organization, or if you don't have access to a bunch of scientific journals or whatever, it's very hard to know, or there's not one place that you can go to see everything that's going on in the conservation world. And I was so curious that I wanted not only European conservators, not only painting conservators, I wanted to see what everybody was doing all over the world across mediums. And I wanted to see the works that weren't being publicized by large organizations and museums. Like, what is your average professional doing in the private sphere, in their home studio? Like, I was just very curious. So I just started reaching out to people at the beginning and said, hi, blah, 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 I'm starting this blog. Can I feature your work? And they were probably like, I guess, weirdo. Okay, sure.
I had anything else to do in lockdown, so I'm sure that they were happy with the company.
I mean, for real, like for me, it was fun. And it just kind of exposed me to more things. And I remember when I got like 200 followers, I was like, what the hell is going on? People are actually interested in this. And then here we are 3 years later, almost at like 30,000. And now, you know, people are regularly sending me their things to share. And it's been so incredibly amazing for me because I mean, I don't get any money from it, which is funny because it's incredibly time consuming. And it's just me by myself. However, it's such a passion project for me. And I think it's really important to share what these private conservators are doing and worldwide what people are doing. And it allows me to have these conversations with people. So not only am I pretty regularly messaging people on Instagram or responding to emails, also from emerging professionals and conservation students and people just with general questions. But also, you know, some people have a piece that needs restoring and they need to know who is in their area. And I am just kind of happy to help. So when I can, when I have the time, I do my best to kind of facilitate all of that. But what's been really cool for me, especially, is how many doors it's opened.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I do these studio features where when I'm in a new city or in a specific area, I will reach out to conservators that I know who are in that area. Or I will post on my stories, hey, I'm going to be here, blah, blah, blah. And if anybody is interested in hosting me in their studio, I happily will go by, take photos while they're working, conduct an interview, and then I can do a studio feature on my page that goes a little bit more in depth on who this person is, what's their story, what are their experiences, kind of like, you know, a deep dive into the individual or the studio. And it's really a win-win because for me, it's so wonderful seeing how everybody sets up their different studios, how people in different countries operate, what they're working on, what they're using. And then for them, it's like free publicity. Of course, they can have all of the photos once I've taken them and sent them over. And then once a month, I have through my page an email list of, I think, almost 400 subscribers. And once a month, they get an email from me with an article about one of their colleagues, one of their peers. And it's really amazing because it is also allows me face-to-face time with conservators, which, as we all know, networking is like the number one in terms of finding jobs, advancing in your career. Just like there's literally no downside to meeting as many people as you can possibly meet in the profession. I mean, everybody knows everybody. And at least what I've found, especially because my background or my educational background is a little bit unconventional, it's very hard to be competitive on paper. So many people in Europe, especially, there's so many of us that everybody has these, varying credentials and a multitude of different experiences. And it's really hard to stick out as an individual and make yourself competitive or attractive. But when somebody meets you face to face, they will learn from that interaction whether or not they can work with you. And maybe they won't hire you on the spot, but they're definitely more likely to take a phone call or an email from you.
I know, like, went down the line when they're going to do exactly what you do, which is say, "Oh, I know this person," and
absolutely, And it seems like a lot of people are really open to, I mean, of course, this depends on availability by both parties, but if a conservator or an organization has a studio or they have a project, or maybe even not, maybe just down the line, if, for me at least, this has worked where I've just said, I would love to come by, I would love to meet you, and if you have the time, I am happy to come in for like a trial day, show you how I work, show you that I'm capable, and see how the two of us get along. Because at the end of the day, even if you're incredibly talented, if you don't vibe with the person, they're not going to want you in their studio. And if you do, they're probably going to be way more likely to want to have you back. So
I actually did a bit of acting growing up, and I learned a lot of lessons then that I find incredibly useful now. And one of the things that they told us about auditions, which are the same things as interviews or job applications, is that once you get to the interview process, once you are like face to face with them, at that point, everyone that they're talking to is qualified. What they're looking for at the interview stage is, are you going to work in our studio? Are we going to like you? Do I want to see you every day?
Yep.
That's really important to keep in mind as well, in addition to all your credentials and the amazing work that you've done.
Yeah. So that's, I guess that's the DL on conversation conservation, and how incredible it has been for, at least for me, networking purposes and like getting into the field. And I have worked with conservators who graduated from their master's program in their 40s. Like, you can do whatever you want to do. And like, there are definitely days where I'm so jealous of all of you professionals who like found this really young and got to pursue it like wholeheartedly and have already had maybe like even sometimes 10 years in a field before you even start getting paid for it. But I have also met a number of conservators that are in the exact same boat as me, where like you're 30 or upwards when you are finished and you are just newly into the profession. And something that I used to take for granted is the fact that I've had a full career before this one. Like, I have so much experience learning how I work, what are my strengths. Like, I have incredible time management. Client relations was like a massive part of my job.
Wow, it sounds like you'd be a really good event planner.
Girl, there is nothing that stresses me out anymore. I mean, truly, the number of things. I mean, anybody who goes to a wedding is like, oh, this is beautiful. Any professional who has ever been to a wedding is like, how many things have gone wrong today that you can't even see? Because 100% of your job is putting out fires in the last minute. So there is nothing now that could even like pretend to give me stress. And so being able to keep calm, problem solve, be, like open to receiving whatever happens and like just figuring it out. Those are huge skills to have. And even though event planning might not seem like a relevant field, and sometimes I was always like, oh, if I didn't just waste those 5 years, like, it's not a waste. Like, I am who I am because of that. It just, every experience you have in your past leads you to where you are and shapes the person that you are.
Jenny and Chloe on the C Word have always talked about how many different avenues there are to becoming a conservator, which is something that, as a listener, I always really appreciated about this podcast. And I think it's really easy to think that there's only a few limited paths. And it's really important to remember that there are just so many more options.
Yeah. It's funny because I have a lot of, this happens every single day where somebody will comment on one of the Instagrams and say like, oh, I'm in the wrong profession. Oh, this would be my dream job. And it's like, it's not too late.
If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, check out our Patreon, where we've uploaded a full extra 10 minutes from this interview as a special mini episode.
Hello, everyone. This evening, I have two wonderful interviewees who are here to talk all things health and safety for EC Police.
My name is Kerith Koss Schrager. I'm an objects conservator, and I also have an advanced degree in occupational health and safety, and I specialize in hazardous collection materials. So my interest in health and safety came rather early in my career because I used to work in hospitals. And so when I got to the museum profession, I was a little surprised at sort of the lack of health and safety programmings in museums, even though we were exposed to a lot of hazardous chemicals and hazardous situations. So I joined our American professional organization, AIC, American Institute for Conservation, where I eventually worked my way up to be the chair of the Health and Safety Network. And so I've been involved in sort of health and safety issues since then. And that sort of encouraged me to go get an advanced degree in occupational health and safety.
It's such an unusual journey. I haven't heard anyone with a similar path as yours.
As far as I know, I'm the only conservator that has both a degree in conservation and health and safety. So hopefully there'll be more of us in the future. Yeah,
I hope so too. And Adrienne?
So I'm Adrienne Gendron. I am a postgraduate fellow in objects conservation at a university museum in the U.S. Well, first initially interested when I was a pre-program student working before going to graduate school, and coming to realize that I had been exposed to certain health and safety issues without my knowledge, and realizing that I had just been completely underprepared for how to deal with these issues, and that really the issues are underrepresented and little understood in the field. So that really piqued my interest, and I started getting involved in health and safety from that point onward. And like Kerith, have also been involved in the AIC Health and Safety Network. I'm currently the publications officer, and I try to bring that lens of health and safety to my work wherever I go.
That's wonderful. Thank you both for joining me today. So my first question for you both is, what health and safety hazards do ECPs often forget to account for?
So I think there are a lot of places in the conservation setting where health and safety hazards are hiding. One of them is hazardous materials and collections, which are often hiding in unexpected places. And there's so many different ways hazards can take form. There are a lot of toxic heavy metals in collections, which can be in the form of pure metal, but also in pigments and dyes. Things like pesticides can be on the surfaces of a lot of organic objects, dealing with things like mold, asbestos, even plasticizers coming out of plastics can be really hazardous as well. And it's not always obvious where these things are. I think it can be really easy to get kind of routine about handling objects, but we can forget that objects can have all kinds of things on their surfaces that can get transferred to our hands and onto other surfaces and into our bodies. So it's really important to practice regular hand washing and good glove hygiene where gloves are appropriate. And I would say another place that often gets overlooked that I've observed is just chemical safety. I think it's really important for emerging professionals to understand that we should be assuming that all solvents can cause reproductive damage and cancer. So this is especially important for younger people to know as they're entering their careers and establishing themselves in the field. And just to be aware and know that it's incredibly important to take ventilation seriously when you're working with solvents, because we're working with these materials over the course of an entire career. So really prioritizing that. And I would say as well, because we are a small field, we often adopt chemicals from other industries, right? And because these materials are used in other industries, it's easy to assume that they're safe for us to use in a conservation context. But this is often not a good assumption, because in conservation we have very specific ways of using our materials that are not the intended usage, such as working with solvents at pure concentrations for really long periods of time in really close proximity to your face. So no one is examining the types of exposure scenarios we're using in conservation treatment because it's such a small field. It's such a different application than it's intended to. So even if a material is purported as safe in another context, it's often intended to be used in a very different way to how we're using it. And I would say just always be skeptical of new materials, especially things like solvents and anything that can enter your breathing zone.
Kerith, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, Adrienne is absolutely correct. But what I also like to remind people is that we also have all of the typical occupational hazards that are found in other workplaces, ergonomics, slips, trips, and falls, working at heights. However, what we don't generally have is the training that goes along with those, where they are more common in other workplace scenarios. So they will have working on lift safety training and those kind of things. We don't tend to have those necessarily within museums because maybe your health and safety department doesn't know exactly what the conservation department is doing. We see this a lot in sort of university settings. Universities generally have a very robust environmental health and safety department because they have wet chemistry labs and all these things, but they tend not to know that the museum also has a wet chemistry lab, is also doing these things. And the museum workers maybe don't know that that environmental health and safety department exists to help them with their health and safety issues. So for sure, you should see if you have one of these departments already, especially if you're at a university, and reach out to them for help. But they often won't know what we do in conservation. And that's sort of the conversation that needs to happen. And part of why I went to get my degree was so that I can interpret those two different departments to help them work together to come up with solutions for our unique exposure scenarios.
What should ECPs look out for when they're starting their first job within an institution?
Health and safety culture is kind of like any culture, like any relationship, where behavior is kind of learned and you follow the example that is set in your workplace. So if you've gone through school or you've gone through other workplaces where a positive health and safety environment has not been modeled for you, then you don't necessarily know what it should look like or what to ask for. And that's why the Health and Safety Network feels like being proactive in reaching out to graduate programs and reaching out to workplaces and providing these resources for people so that they can say, look, like I have this guide sheet of the safety training that I'm supposed to receive when I start at a new job. I've found that most people don't get health and safety training when they start their new jobs. So you should be aware that that's something that you should be getting almost immediately when you start somewhere.
Yeah, I can add to that. I think we've both touched upon that health and safety is not prioritized in conservation training. So it's a really good idea to try to educate yourself as much as you can about what the potential hazards can be and empower yourself with that knowledge. But also, I don't think conservators in general, and especially ECPs, can be expected to know all the answers for health and safety. That's why Kerith went to get a second degree, right? So instead, I think it's important to aim for being able to ask questions and find out more information. So, finding out if there is any health and safety personnel associated with your institution. If not, finding out if there are any contacts that people have set up already with someone in a health and safety field that can provide guidance. But if there really is no one connected to your institution, you really can't be expected to be an expert. So it's great to try to find resources online. AIC has a health and safety forum with connections to industrial hygienists where you can ask questions related to your specific problem. But I would say in terms of overall culture, just being able to enter a space and kind of look for certain things about what people are doing and what the standards are in a workplace. So things I'm always curious about are, is there a culture of checking SDS sheets for new materials and familiarizing yourself with the safety concerns around materials before using them? Are there ventilation controls, and are people using them appropriately? Are people labeling decanted chemicals? Is there a hazardous waste disposal procedure? Is there a procedure for identifying hazardous materials in collections and addressing that risk? And in addition to that, I would add also monitoring of equipment. So things like eye wash stations, fume hood, airflow rates, fire extinguishers, everything like that, because those things require upkeep and maintenance as well. So that's kind of like a basic checklist of things I'm interested to know about when I'm looking at a new workplace.
Interesting. Within the United States institutions, do you find that the health and safety protocols differ?
Having worked in a range of different types of institutions, it's really interesting to see how like the size of the institution really kind of influences the health and safety protocols.
Larger institutions, the Smithsonian, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, those are large enough institutions that they have permanent health and safety staff, whereas that is not necessarily true of most other sort of smaller museums. If you work at a historic house, in that scenario, they usually have assigned a staff member who has no health and safety training to sort of be the health and safety person in charge. And that can vary from person to person of how motivated they are going to be to try and follow regulations and health and safety standards. So you never know really what you're going to get into when you start somewhere. And all the things that Adrienne pointed out are really important as signs of what to expect down the road.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're asking questions about labeling things and your supervisor is saying, oh, that doesn't matter, then you can kind of get a sense that how sort of their interpretation of health and safety is within the workplace. And it's very difficult when you have supervisors and managers who aren't on board with health and safety to try and change the culture within your institution.
In terms of ECPs starting their own private practice, what advice do you have for them?
I'm no longer an emerging conservator, but I was when I started my private practice, and I was in private practice for 12 years. It's the same thing you have to do when you're building your conservation practice from a treatment perspective as well. You're not always going to be able to take the projects that are presented to you if you don't have the resources to handle them. So if you didn't have the correct tools to do the treatment, you also couldn't take that treatment. And so for me, I was working out of my home in the very beginning. And so eventually I had children in my home. So I could not do super heavy solvent work projects in the very beginning. If I did, I had to find other studio spaces that were better equipped, that I could either rent space or another conservator would let me use their fume extractor at the time. And then over time, as I started getting more business, I was able to invest in more health and safety resources, and then I could take on bigger projects. So I think the tendency is for people to say, well, I'll get a fume extractor eventually when I get down the road. And because the solvents I'm working on aren't that bad. And as Adrienne was mentioning, you should approach every solvent as if it has some sort of health effect issues. And there are some that will give you cancer, but there are others that you could get a sensitivity to. And it doesn't seem like a big deal, but if a conservator gets a sensitivity to acetone, that's quite an inconvenience. It could be career ending if you get sensitive to certain chemicals. So even small chemical exposures are not good, and you should try to reduce your exposure to everything as much as possible.
Could you let me know of any health and safety must-reads for ECPs? I can add them in the show notes as well for our listeners.
Yeah, so the AIC has a health and safety wiki online, which is free to access. There's a lot of resources on there for educating yourself about health and safety. Specifically, there's a beginner's guide to health and safety there, and there's a lot of really useful information about PPE, which I reference a lot whenever I'm in a new situation and need to refresh myself. And then another resource I go to a lot is the Hazards in Collections e-tool, which is a really user-friendly website that outlines a lot of the major hazardous materials and collections and where to find them and what they look like and what the concerns are.
There's also a 6-week online course that's now free and open to the public that was organized through AIC that covers a lot of the topics we covered today in more detail. And there's individual presentations by health and safety experts on each of these topics.
Thank you, ladies, very much for your insightful conversation and your advice.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. This was great.
Hello again to all our student and emerging professional listeners. This was not the first Emerging Professional-centered episode. There have been 2 more episodes. One was Season 1, Episode 5, and the second one was Season 2, Episode 4. However, there are many more episodes that are great resources for our ECP community and that I have listened to myself again and again as a student and more recently while I was searching for employment. Here are a few of them that I like to refer to. Most recently, in Season 13, there was Episode 2, which is centered around ICON accreditation. It might not be relevant immediately to yourself or to myself. However, it is good to think about the benefits that ICON accreditation could give us in the future. In Season 12, there were a lot of useful tips for ECPs. Firstly, in Episode 6, which was about time management, and then also in Episode 1, about job interviews. Season 11 has a great episode, Episode 4, titled Building a Business, which is a great resource for those of you who, like Liz and Alexis, are looking into private practice as a career path. Season 10, Episode 5, Aches and Pains, could be of interest as well. Personally, I have been on the job for only about a year and a half, and I can already see how the profession has affected my body. So this is a very relevant topic for us. Now going further down the line in Season 5, Episode 5 is all about creating portfolios. I must have listened to that one about 3 or 4 times over the years. Finally, the last episode I'd like to refer to is Season 4, Episode 2, which is about parenthood. I listened to that one today, actually, as I am now starting to think about starting a family and the dangers of exposure to solvents and other health and safety hazards in our workplace. Honestly, there are many, many more episodes that I have not mentioned here that could be helpful to you. So go ahead and dig a little deeper into the C-Word archives.
Dear Jane, from Alex, how can conservators get more work in more unusual specialisms that aren't typically covered in universities? I'm thinking about stuff like natural history, industrial objects, etc. Most jobs I see specify you must already have experience, but it seems there's no easy way to get it without already having a similar job. Bit of a catch-22. Dear Alex, first let me apologise for being so unbelievably late in responding to your question. There's no excuse. So, your question was about specialisms not usually covered. Obviously, what you can do is pick off some specialisms in a sideways kind of a way from a university. So if you were interested in industrial, for example, you might find something that did objects would cover you for industrial pathways. Natural history, again, you might be able to do that through, I think there is a specialist degree in natural history in Europe. I think it's in Germany, and I'm really sorry that I can't find it, and I can't be any later than I already am in replying. But what you can do, again, is pick up a more objects thing and then specialise by either volunteering as a student or looking for short-term contracts or helping out or even going on courses. So looking for natural history conservation in the UK, which is where I'm based, you will be able to take some training courses, for example, with people who teach natural history conservation. And those courses might be findable on a commercial site. My experience of seeing people into the profession has been through more general objects courses and volunteering and just finding their way in. I've also seen people who've got natural history specialisms of geologists and natural scientists going the other way and doing a conservation degree and going in that way. But I think from your question, it is the other way around. And so I think really it is the same thing with all of conservation. You have to know what it is that you want and really go after that, whilst always ensuring yourself on behind, backing yourself up with a kind of a plan B plan. So if you're interested in natural science conservation, at some point you're bound to have to deal with pesticides and contaminants. You'll have to deal with feathers or fur. So you might be able to deal with them in a sideways way through a more traditional conservation course and raise that and develop that sort of experience in that way. You can also go and meet people doing the specialism that you fancy and ask them what their route into the sector is. That will normally give you an illustration. And again, the ones that I'm thinking of who are perhaps at the very top of their field probably developed the field themselves from a natural sciences background. And the people now who are sort of moving into it normally have done conservation and then started to volunteer either in some of the big museums with natural scientists or so on and so forth. Same with industry. So the industrial conservators I know, sort of the people towards the end of their careers were engineers, and the people towards the beginnings of their careers came in conservation and specialised in engineering. So I think, Alex, the thing for you to do, I don't know whether you've got a degree. If you haven't got a degree, go get a degree, but get one somewhere where there'll be a degree of specialisation and an opportunity to volunteer, but then you will also have some other experience. So if you want to do ship models, or you only want to work on military collections, First World War collections, or something like that, you can still build up a specialism around those topics whilst being more generally qualifiable as a general objects conservator. Once you're qualified, or if you decide to go in with an internship, which is obviously the perfect route, then you can build up your experience and confidence working in that area. So again, there might be opportunities for you to contact people from, perhaps if you're in the UK, from the Conservation Register, or look up other listings of conservators and ask them if there's even volunteering or placements or something you can help out with. I think these worlds are so small that if you kind of start to appear in that world and keep popping up, eventually people will start to know who you are and perhaps draw you in. Unfortunately, like so much in conservation, there's quite a long lead in with not very much pay and a lot of giving away your time and labour for free, which is problematic, and I know it is, which is why I was saying, if possible, do it as a sort of a double skill, so to always try and identify 2 skills that you're getting out of every experience, so that if you don't end up as a specialist conservator, you can go in another direction. I don't know if that was very helpful, and it's certainly a very late response, but I'm going to send it off. Over and out.
Thanks for listening. We're the C Word, and today you've been listening to Liz, Phedra, and Alexis. Tune in next time for an episode about historic houses. In the meantime, check out our website at thecword.show, or check us out on social media. You can find us on Mastodon, Facebook, Instagram, and X, formerly known as Twitter. You can also email us on thecwordpodcast@gmail.com. The intro and outro music is Spring by DD Music, used under Creative Commons Attribution License. Additional music and sound effects by Callum Robertson. And as usual, this has been a Wooden Dice production.